The 2020-2021 NHL season, which I guess is now just the 2021 NHL season, is finally underway. Unless, of course, I actually was able to get this video out the day I'm recording it, in which case, happy NHL Season Eve. Or something like that anyway. Either way though, today we are going to be back to looking at some protection lists and what players could be available for the Kraken to select in the upcoming expansion draft. And today we're going to finish up with the California teams with the San Jose Sharks. Now, unlike the two teams before the Sharks, what the 2021 NHL season holds as far as success is concerned is still fairly up in the air. And as a result, depending on how the season goes early on for the Sharks, this roster could look pretty different by the time the end of the season rolls around. But either way, we're going to go with what we have now, so let's see what we're working with. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can help you out. Now, the Sharks are coming off of quite a bit of a disappointing season last year after going to the conference finals the year before with largely the same core that they have now, although Joe Thornton has moved on to Toronto. So while this year's new top-heavy division and a team that is trending down would suggest that the Sharks might not be looking at the playoffs this year either, there still is potential on this team to be at least a dark horse for that fourth spot in the division. So if by the trade deadline the Sharks do look like they're in the hunt for the playoffs, they could be tempted into being buyers and trying to get at least one more year out of this core and another run at the playoffs. But on the other end of it, if by that time they look like they're completely out of the playoff picture, this is definitely the type of team that could be looking to sell off some of its pieces and try to get out of some of that cap trouble that they have in their future and just start the rebuild now. So again, if you're watching this a few months from now, things could look pretty different for the Sharks, but for now, this is the roster we're working with. So as we do start to get to the players that I think will be protected by the Sharks on the forward end, there are four pretty obvious choices in Logan Couture, Timo Meier, and Tomas Hertl, as well as Evander Kane, although that one might not be as obvious as we thought it was going to be just a few days ago. And that's because just recently the news broke that Kane has filed for bankruptcy, being well over $20 million in debt. And then on top of that, he even said that he's considering voiding the rest of his contract and maybe even retiring, citing health concerns after having his kid being born recently. But at least for now, Kane is still very much a part of the Sharks, and it seems like he could very much use the money that's left on his contract, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that he'll stay with the Sharks at least for 1 or 2 more seasons. Now, once again, this is where things could get a little bit interesting, because if things don't change much for the Sharks as far as their roster is concerned, there is a scenario where they could end up protecting 4 defensemen that we'll get into in just a little bit. But honestly, I don't think that it's all that likely, so I do think this is probably another team that will be protecting the 7 forwards and 3 defensemen. So to fill those other 3 spots, I do think that it's pretty likely that Kevin Labanc and Ryan Donato end up getting 2 of them. And then for that 7th and final spot, once again, I do think this will come largely down to who ends up performing the best in this next season, which for the Sharks could also have a lot to do with how much, or if at all, the AHL is able to play, as a lot of these guys are still playing the majority of their time there. But if it were to happen now, I think it's most likely they would end up protecting one of their young centers, so I'm going to go with Maxime Letunov in that spot. And when we get to which players I do think will be available for the Kraken to select, if they do decide to go the 4-4 route and protect just 4 forwards, that would probably mean that both Kevin Labanc and Ryan Donato are available. In that case, one of those 2 players is absolutely the best option for the Kraken. Probably Labanc, but also if Donato has a good season, he has looked pretty good to this point in his career as well, so he would also be a pretty decent option. But again, I don't think that that's super likely, and we'll talk about why as we get to which defenders I think the Sharks are likely to protect. Now, for as complicated as this could end up being for the Sharks, the situation is pretty straightforward. As it stands right now, both Erik Karlsson and Marc-Edouard Vlasic both have no movement clauses, so they would be forced to be protected by the team. Both players are coming off of not necessarily their best seasons in the NHL, although things were much worse for Vlasic, and for Karlsson, it's largely more to do with how big his contract is. Although that being said, it's Vlasic who has what is looked at as one of the worst current contracts in the NHL. Now, who knows, Karlsson, or even Vlasic for that matter, could end up bouncing back and looking like the players that are worth the contracts that they have. But assuming that that doesn't happen, both could be pretty likely to be asked to waive those new movement clauses. Which is something that when it came to the last expansion draft with Vegas, most of the players that were asked to waive those new movement clauses were willing to do so. So I do think that it's fairly likely that one of the 2 would end up being available. But again, we can't make that assumption, so for now, for argument's sake, we're just going to say that both of those guys end up getting protected. Which, if they want to protect 7 forwards, leaves just 1 spot open on the defensive end, which I think would be most likely to go to Brent Burns. although he also is looking for a bounce back season and does also have a fairly sizable contract. But if they were forced into this situation, the reason they could err on the side of protecting forward defensemen is because this would leave Radim Šimik. And then as far as goaltenders go, well, there's not a whole lot of tempting options here and a couple of not particularly great contracts at the NHL level. So I would imagine the Sharks would probably recognize that the Seattle wouldn't be likely to take one of those guys and would probably go for protecting the youngster Kornar. But again, Seattle's not likely getting one of their 3 goaltenders from this team, so I'm not entirely sure how much it really matters who they end up protecting. So now finally, which players from the Sharks I think will be available for the Seattle Kraken to end up selecting. Again, on the forward end, if either LeBanc or Donato are available for selection, I think they're pretty much as good as gone, with LeBanc being the better of the 2 options. But especially in his case, I do think it's pretty likely the Sharks will find a way to protect him, especially considering he is under contract through 2024, which would make him all the more tempting for the Kraken, considering they do have to select a minimum number of players that are at least under contract for their first season. So whether for the Sharks it's protecting 7 forwards, or maybe Evander Kane does leave and then that 4th guaranteed spot ends up going to him, again, it's very unlikely that LeBanc is going to be available. But again, assuming both of those players are protected, which I do think is the most likely scenario at this point, that does still leave a few other options for the Kraken to take from the forward end. And if it's NHL experience that you're looking for, Marcus Sorensen is probably the best option. At 28 years old, Sorensen has played 197 games in the NHL in at least part of 4 different seasons. In that time, he does just have 59 points on 30 goals and 29 assists, plus last year in 66 games, he had just 18 points on 7 goals and 11 assists. And from an advanced stat perspective, he has been a slightly above average player, but again with a down year last year. So at least from an offensive perspective in the NHL anyway, he hasn't necessarily been exactly what the Sharks were hoping for. But at the AHL level, he did show that he could be a pretty consistent scorer and had some pretty good offensive talent. So you would think, at least from his AHL experience anyway, that offensive output is still very much there to be tapped into. But at 28, it better show up sooner rather than later. The other thing Sorensen does have going for him, though, is that he is definitely a bigger forward and plays pretty physically, which for a Ron Francis-led team could make him a little bit more tempting of an option, and they could just end up playing him as more of a third-line physical forward than as a points producer. But again, as the Kraken look at the Sharks, if they are willing to, or even looking to go a little bit more youthful, there are a number of options from this team. Again, there's Maxim Letunov, who I mentioned earlier is a potential to be protected, as well as Jonathan Dahlian, who also could very well end up protected, and then a couple of guys with local ties in Dylan Gambrell and Alex True. All 4 of them are 23 to 24 years old and don't have a whole lot of significant NHL experience. Outside of maybe Gambrell, who did have 50 games last season, although he did just have 11 points on 5 goals and 6 assists. But he is from Bonnie Lake, so he's got that going for him anyway. I mean, Dahlian has yet to play at the NHL level. Letunov has played in just 3 games, although he did get his first goal in one of those. And then the ex-Seattle Thunderbird Alex True played in 12 NHL games and has 4 assists to show for it. But while they do all have yet to truly break into the NHL, again, maybe Gambrell aside, as you can see at the AHL level, they all 4 have shown an ability to score at a pretty impressive rate, or at least a pretty good rate anyway. And of course, as is the case with any player, whether or not that points productions for these guys ends up translating to the NHL level will remain to be seen. But it is at least a promising sign. So really, as far as I'm concerned, any one of these 4 guys could be a pretty decent option for the Kraken to select and probably stick in the AHL at least to start with. Obviously with True and a little bit more so Gambrell offering cool stories and the fact that they would be coming back to Washington, whether it's where they're actually from or just where they played earlier on in their junior careers. And then with Dahlian and Letunov potentially offering a little bit more of a higher ceiling if they do break into the NHL and find success. So we did spend a long time on forwards, but again, I think if the guy that the Kraken are going to get from the Sharks is currently on their roster, it's probably one of these guys. And that's because as we get to the defensive end, Šimik is really the best available option, and really probably the only tempting available option if he is available. But again, to me, that's a pretty strong if, as I do think the Sharks will be able to get either Karlsson or more likely Vlasic to waive the no movement clause so that they can protect Šimik. And if Karlsson or Vlasic are available, it's likely because they weren't able to show significant improvement in this last season, or for Karlsson because they just don't think he's worth that contract anymore. In either case, they're probably not going to be terribly tempting options for the Kraken to select. Maybe Karlsson, but again, that would just be if they're struggling to meet their cap minimum. And really their only other option if they're going to protect 3 players and they end up having to protect both of those guys would be to protect Šimik and leave Brent Burns available. And for Burns, he is kind of in a prove-it season, as he didn't have his greatest year last year either, and does have a pretty sizable contract at the age of 35. But for Burns, even though he is a little bit older, again, he is a defenseman, which means his career is likely to go a little bit longer than your average forward anyway. He also, as a point-scoring defenseman, has had a pretty successful career that has certainly earned him the contract that he currently has. So if he is somehow available, and it's not because he's had a drastically worse season this year than he did last year, which already was not a particularly good season for him, then he could be a very hard option for the Kraken to pass up and could end up bringing his, at that point, likely over 700 games and over 500 points of experience to Seattle. So I guess then on the defensive end, really the only other thing that's probably worth mentioning is that while Simek was probably the Sharks' best defenseman last season, or certainly was for a large portion of it, he did also suffer a pretty bad leg injury that he is trying to rehab from, so there is always the potential that he isn't able to really be the same player coming back from that, and in that case, he probably isn't the type of guy the Kraken are likely to go for. So as I finally do get to closing this out, once again, if things don't change too much for the Sharks roster, I do think it's most likely that one of those 4 young forwards will be the one ending up in Seattle. But a lot could still change for the Sharks, so we'll just have to see how this season goes. Otherwise, if you have made it to this point in the video, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Otherwise, there's a lot of options for the Sharks, so I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments section below as to what you think things could look like for this team. Otherwise, until next time, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace!